Hello, everyone, and welcome to this First Friday webinar in May. This month, we have Occupancy Management 101 and why it should matter to you. We're very excited for this presentation. I do want to just start off with a couple reminders. If you get logged into your Gmail account, you'll be able to chat with us and ask any questions in the bottom corner underneath the screen. And at the end of it, I'll post the assessment, and you can go ahead and take that. But at this time, I'm going to give it over to our presenters, and they're going to go ahead and get started.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kathryn Magura, and I'm the Assistant Director for Operations down at Oregon State University.
And I'm Silvina Sousa-Ransford. I'm the Associate Director with University Housing for Services and Systems.
So we were asked to do this presentation at NWACUHO to give a bit of an overview about occupancy management, and then the opportunity presented itself to do this as a First Friday webinar, and here we are. So with that, I think Silvina's going to take the first one here.
All right, thank you, Kathryn. So a little bit about who we are. I'll give you a bit of background about myself, and then Kathryn can do as well. In terms of who I am, I have been in university housing occupancy for about 15 years. And it's been just amazing over the last few years to be part of such a great team of colleagues and peers. Prior to that, I did about 10 years in enrollment services, so recruitment, advising, and other components of the work that we do, that support the work that we do. Kathryn?
Yeah, I also have been working in occupancy management for over 15 years. I started off as a kind of an office manager, assignments coordinator hybrid position, and then have worked my way up the ranks from there. They keep giving me more responsibility, so they're either trying to keep me out of trouble or trying to keep me entertained or something. But yeah, it's been interesting over the last decade or so to see how our field has changed and what we're asked to do now versus what we've done in the past.
Wonderful. And just for awareness, I do have a cold, so if I start coughing, it's okay. I have my things here. But anyways, what we wanted to get a sense too is who you are out there in terms of our listeners, so that we can also speak to that experience throughout our presentation. So if you just want to message and give us a sense of who's all listening in terms of position and so forth, it's extremely helpful to gauge and provide context that is more meaningful to you. All right, and then as we get that information, if we're able to see it, that would be wonderful. All right, Kathryn.
Okay, so as we're waiting for people to share their information, it's fine if you're not able to. We want to go over a little bit of context. So one of the reasons that we were asked to do this is because occupancy management is one of the core competencies within NWACUHO, our parent international organization. So there's a lot of tenets within occupancy management that they've now put into competencies, and there's also standards and ethical principles within occupancy management. So essentially there's ethical guidelines for how we do our work that were established by NWACUHO. And I'm not able to open the links on these, but they are available through the NWACUHO website. Both of these links are. And I would encourage you, if you are curious about occupancy management or you work in the field yourself, take a look at these documents and just kind of see how they complement the work that you do, or how they could really influence the work that you're doing.
All right, so perhaps the biggest thing for us is to start off with a common definition of what occupancy management is. And occupancy management, as you can see on the screen, is the relationship between numbers and understanding how these numbers are impacted by a wide range of environmental factors. Again, it's not operating in a bubble, but rather looking at numbers and how they interact with other things around campus. And so we'd like to take you through some of those in the next few slides to talk about that experience and that relationship.
We're starting off with some of the lingo here that we use. One of the things that I learned pretty quickly, especially as we were working with our residential education partners, is that I will throw out words like occupancy, capacity, yield rates, and there's not a shared understanding of what those terms mean. So now we're going to go through some of those key terms and explain them to you all.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kathryn. So in terms of capacity, design capacity and occupancy, if you think about capacity, that is the information that we're always trying to figure out is what were our buildings intended to be or to hold in terms of how many beds? Were they supposed to be doubles, singles, triples? As we know in the kind of work that we do, if you report that this year, next year, that may look a little bit different because we've taken some rooms offline and repurposed them. But again, we try to look at what the actual capacity of the building, the design capacity was intended to be. Occupancy for us is the census data. How many students are living with us? Here at the University of Oregon, that means reporting numbers on what we call fourth week. So we are on the quarter system, so we have to report that pretty much every quarter on the fourth week. We have 11 weeks in the term. And at that point, we're reporting the number of students residing with us, so our occupancy, because we believe that 4 weeks into the term, our students will know whether this is the place for them, whether they are continuing with their coursework, if they have not withdrawn from classes, so all of those things. But for us, fourth week is a huge component, and that is what leads on to the budget occupancy. Budget occupancy is the concept around what our administration, specifically for within university housing, what they have identified as the number that we need to target during our fourth week in order to maintain and be able to support our budgetary needs within university housing. Many of us, I don't know of any that are not self-sufficient entities within universities, so this is key. And again, we're projecting ahead based upon what we think we will have on campus for our students.
And it definitely impacts all of us if we're under that budget occupancy pretty significantly.
Right, and we're asked to project that oftentimes ahead of time based upon the next term, which is enrollment projections. So enrollment projections for us is huge, because if the Office of Admissions is projecting that they will have a certain amount of students residing with us, attending the university, then we also use that information to project how many of those will be living with us. At the University of Oregon, and as well as many other institutions, you have live-on requirements. And so for us, if we know what the incoming class is projected to be, we can anticipate that 90% of those will reside on campus, and the other 10% will go through exemptions. Enrollment projections are a number that is set a year in advance, if not longer. Oftentimes, universities project out 5 years in order to do their budget, their university budget. And so as we look at those, we try to plan ahead whether they are trying to admit more, admit less, because then that impacts what we do with our buildings. So going back to what our occupancy will be, and of course the capacity, because if the university is projecting a higher number for their enrollment, then we also need to figure out how to make spaces happen. And as we look at a lot of factors, it's not only what the university, who the university is admitting, but also what their decisions will be. Oftentimes, a university will have a 12% yield rate. This is, they will admit a certain number of students, but only 12% of those will decide to attend the institution. For example, if you are looking for a class that is projected to be about 5,000, 4,500 students, then you should admit 15,000 or more students in order to yield that number, because you know that only about 12% of those may decide to attend your institution. The other thing that we are experiencing right now, I sort of like to refer to this as sort of our May madness rather than March madness, in that we're trying to figure out for this last week specifically what decisions are being made by our students in order to try to figure out what our yield rate is going to be. In other words, we're anticipating a certain number over the summer as we have our orientations, new student programs. Those numbers will fluctuate. So the yield rate, meaning what will melt for our students. So a yield rate for us is how many students will cancel between confirming, orientation, and housing. And that experience is what they call the melt. So again, the yield rate is the percentage of students that will confirm from the admitted pool. The melt, just for clarification, I think I blurred those two. The melt is what happens during the summer, literally melting of students' numbers over the summer. Go ahead, Kathryn.
As I said, there's all sorts of fancy algorithms out there that people in enrollment management will use to try and figure out what that yield rate will be. As Silvina was just mentioning too, May 1st down in the States is that college commit day. So that's the date that most institutions have set that students have to make their indication that they're attending that institution. So a lot of stuff's been up in the air for many of us up until that May 1st date. Students will get admitted to multiple institutions. As an example, Silvina and I, our campuses are both public institutions in the state of Oregon, about 45 minutes from each other. So we have a lot of people double dipping. And theoretically, earlier this week, students decided, yes, I'm going to major in music and go to the University of Oregon, or yes, I'm going to major in engineering and go to Oregon State. And that way we can start doing all those plannings for what we need to do in terms of what is our actual intake going to be, our yield rate.
Kathryn, thank you for that. That gave me a moment for a tea break.
Okay.
Thank you. I think too, the other thing with regards to the yield rate melt is that other departments are looking at what we are seeing through our numbers. You know, as the students confirm, the next thing is, are they going to sign up for housing? That's also a greater indicator of how that yield and that melt rate will work itself out. Lastly, as kind of two other terms, the overflow is when we have to figure out what to do when the enrollment projections, the yield rate, and the melt are actually extremely amazing, because we always want them to be very strong numbers. In other words, we want our enrollment projections to be high. We want our yield rate and melt. We want our yield rate to be high. We want our melt to be low, because the other factor that we have to deal with, which for our university is something that we're going to be discussing shortly, is what happens if our numbers are higher than what our occupancy, our capacity can be. So we have to factor in what kinds of things we need to do, such as looking at tripling rooms, lounges, or even some of those really concepts that challenge some of our live-in staff, which is RAs may get roommates. You know, that's just a factor. So for us is looking at that and then trying to anticipate how long will we be in that overflow. As we know, when we have students moving in, we think you're going to have a certain number, but once the move-in has concluded a week later and you're doing audits, you're recognizing that some students just did not come or have left within that week. So for us, that overflow need will be met by that activity during the first couple of weeks, whereby we can move students out of lounges and other areas that we've created temporarily in order to accommodate this higher number of residents. I know from experience that once you put students into lounges and you've created this amazing space, they really don't want to leave. And so how do you create and find some spaces whereby they can feel that it's also a wonderful housing opportunity? And this leads into consolidations. Consolidations is one of those things that we know we need to do, but it's something I don't look forward to, which is when you have students who are residing by themselves and they have grown accustomed to that. And then all of a sudden you're saying, by the way, you're going to have a roommate because we need to move somebody out of the lounges. And they were just trying to go under the radar in order to maintain their single rooms. And so at that point, we're trying to move students within communities first to generate those open spaces. But then that means we also may need to look at moving students outside of their community into a new community. And that in itself also opens up a lot of work for our live-in staff and trying to make sure the roommate conflict negotiations are all working. Kathryn?
One of the ways that we do consolidations here too at Oregon State is traditionally what we've seen is that we have a high percentage of students who identify as men who apply late. So I'll have women with vacancies in their rooms and men potentially going into lounges. And so if I've got two women on the same floor in double occupancy rooms, without roommates, I'm going to move one in with the other so I can open up a room for two students who would otherwise go into lounges. And it's amazing whether they're here physically living in those spaces and have to get consolidated, or they're not here and it's still summer and we're still planning, the reaction seems to be the same, as in, it's not fair, I don't want to, how could you? It's just kind of fascinating how attached people get to that space. So part of the communication plan that we do throughout the summer and throughout the application process is your contract's for a space in our system and not a specific room, because we need the ability to be as flexible as possible to really utilize our space well. So moving forward with some of the additional lingo, and this is not by any means a comprehensive list of all of the lingo within occupancy management. These were just some of the things that Silvina and I brainstormed that come up frequently that can have some conflicting or confusing definition. So we wanted to get those clarified. So one of the other things, terms here is exemptions. Silvina mentioned live-on policies and requiring students to live on campus. In that process, if you've got students required to live on campus, you should have a process by which they can request to be exempt from that. So an example for us with our live-on policy, if students live within a certain radius of the campus, they can file for an exemption if they're going to live at home with family. So having a way for a student to seek that exemption, and then looking at those statistics of what is your percentage of the students who are admitted for that cohort who might either be exempt or seek an exemption, because that's going to factor into how you utilize your space. Got the word lottery here as we talk about how assignments are made for rooms. Sometimes, especially if you're allowing students to select their own spaces, you might have what's called a lottery in terms of how you allocate a time in which the student can select their space. So with that, oftentimes, you might just be based on when they apply for housing, or you might just say, it doesn't matter when you applied, you'll randomly be allotted your lottery time to go select your space.
And then, Kathryn, I think for us too, another term aligned with lottery is priority. For many institutions, the date which the students submitted their housing application and paid their deposits or prepayments, that allows the student to have a certain priority or lottery towards by how we make assignments.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you. Retention is one of the biggest components of occupancy management. So all of this is good. You can have the best plan possible for getting students in spaces. You can have a beautiful lottery system. But if students aren't staying, if they are moving out before that 4th week or they're withdrawing between terms, then your retention rate is going to be low. So as we go back to doing the budget occupancy that Silvina was mentioning, so much of that depends on your retention rate. Are students staying? Are they coming back for an additional year after that first year living on? Here at Oregon State, for the longest time, there's been that kind of internal philosophy of you live on campus, it's a one and done. So you live on campus 1 year and then you move off campus after that. When enrollment was starting to get lower for incoming students, who are our typical population of students living on campus, we started having conversations at the department level of how do we build our occupancy? We don't want to have to close buildings. We don't have funds to renovate buildings. So how do we build the population of students who aren't required to live on campus up? How do we build that 2nd year and above population? So again, all of that plays into that retention process.
And Kathryn, if I could just add one more thing to that too, is the retention process too for us is where we have a lot of collaborative relationships with other departments, because for our university housing contract, our students are required to be at 12 units full time. So this is where too, as part of that occupancy retention, is we're also working on making sure that our students are registered full time, that they will continue on and be able to be connected with resources.
Yeah, thank you. Demand is another term that we have on here, and that's is you're looking at your applications coming in, what's the demand on space? If you're looking to be over your budget capacity, how's that demand factor into how you make placements? For us, one way we use demand, we have what we call some special interest communities. One of those would be substance-free communities. We had some tentative placements for those communities moving into our fall quarter here. But then we were looking at our application information and noticed that the demand simply wasn't there to have as many of those communities in place as we had set. So in working with my lovely partners in my residential conduct office, we decided that it would be best if we restricted and removed one of those communities so that we didn't have a lot of students getting assigned to a space that were not interested in it. We found it would be more beneficial to have scarcity of space, so to speak. So if we have 50 beds and we have 65 people who want it, that's better than having 75 beds and only 50 people who want it, because then you get some of those weird dichotomies of, well, I didn't want to be assigned here, now you're making me do this, and all these different things. So there's a lot of complexity that goes into this process. And with that leads me into the communication plan. I feel very fortunate here that we have a marketing team internal to our department who is really great at helping us with our communication plan. There's a lot of intricacies in the housing assignments process that can get a bit wordy. And so I often go to my marketing team and say, help me wordsmith this, help me make this visually a way and representative of a way that students are going to help understand it. But it's important to make sure that you're communicating out your timelines, when your applications are available, when students need to pay any sort of deposits if you have those, when you expect to start having assignments made, things like that, so that students are aware up front what deadlines they have in place and what they need to meet in when. We've touched on this a little bit in some of what we've talked about already, but your forecasting your trends. During the year, I spent a lot of time looking at both the forecasting and the trends. So forecast, similar to a weathercaster, which actually kind of explains a lot now that I think about it. We're kind of the Al Rokers of our field, but we're looking out there and we're trying to figure out, okay, what do we see as the enrollment trends over the last couple of years? What is it that we're seeing in terms of graduation rates in the state of Oregon? As two institutions where a lot of in-state students will go, that's really important. So if we know that the incoming senior class of high school students is lower, then perhaps our intake of students from the state of Oregon for that next year is going to be lower. So how do we recruit out to students in surrounding states to attend our institutions? And then again, the trend data. What are we seeing in terms of our retention rates? How many students are staying from year to year? What are we getting in terms of feedback on that roommate relationship? What are we seeing in terms of the communication plan? How is social media factoring into all this stuff? So we really do look at that trend data. And then the last thing we have on here is housing management systems, or HMS. Many people will talk about HMS and how that really impacts pretty much everything that we do at this point in time in our work. So you hear about companies like StarRes, Adirondack Solutions, RMS, Seaboard. Those are just some of them. That's not all of them. But those are the various software systems that we use to make all of this magic happen.
Absolutely. And they become extremely fun, especially if you are implementing while at the same time trying to deploy a new communication plan or take the opportunity to see how you're going to do your lottery. How are you going to review your exemption? So it can add an extreme level of fun, but also some flexibility. Oftentimes we're limited by what we can do because our systems are not up to par. So looking at opportunities within those systems to help you get there is fun on most days. We are in our second year of implementation of a software system. So we're in that moment where we're looking forward to the next couple of weeks.
It's all fun and games until your server crashes.
That's right.
Okay, so now we've talked about some of the lingo, and we want to move on to some of the stakeholders. Again, this is by no means a comprehensive list of the people we work with, but it just kind of gives you an overview of, on a day-to-day basis, who we're interacting with in the assignments and occupancy management process.
All right, thank you, Kathryn. And I think throughout our session, we've been defining what some of these concepts are, but also oftentimes we'll also indicate the kinds of stakeholders that we work with. And so right now is a bit of a recap on that. So for us, in terms of admissions and enrollment, here at the University of Oregon, this is an amazing relationship that we began planning out years in advance. So whatever our team in enrollment and admissions goes out and recruits students, we want to make sure that they have our updated information, to make sure that they are explaining what our university housing opportunities are and what the newest changes are. Some of us, we are building academic residential communities as we speak, and so it's hard to maintain our enrollment folks out there updated on the road. And as someone who was a former admissions counselor, certainly value the work that they do, the hours on the road that they put in order to recruit our students and sell the dream of higher education. It's a very tiresome, but very exciting. You're just connecting with prospective students. I think that's how I got sick about a month ago, was from doing some of those enrollment trips. But what we see is the work that they do, bringing in the students and then kind of passing it on to us in the future. We also work with participating in those events. So not only for us is working with the students that are recruited and admitted, but also being present at those events to participate in those activities and recruitment events.
And Silvina mentioned this or alluded to it a little bit with the academic partnerships that we have. So many of us have academic learning programs in our halls, living learning communities. And with that, we've got a lot of the academic units involved in terms of those partnerships. So I mentioned earlier that we have a fairly good engineering program here. So we've got an engineering facility in partnership. And so it's important to work with those partners to ensure that they have all of the information necessary, or better yet, know who to connect them to in housing to get questions answered as they're working with students on a daily basis.
Absolutely. And Kathryn, you mentioned earlier in terms of projections and how a particular program may be projecting higher numbers, and then all of a sudden the applications aren't coming in at that level because our students have changed. What we built was not what perhaps they were seeking. And so working with those academic units to readjust their numbers and shifting their locations, because when we place students in buildings and we've projected a certain numbers, we have to determine how that placement will either expand or contract. In other words, if they don't have enough students to fill that floor, who else can we place in there that will allow for an amazing partnership with that particular program in that floor? Mm-hmm. And so having those conversations in advance with our academic partners is extremely important.
Yep.
All right. ADA. So this is where we work with our students with the Americans with Disabilities Act. And we have departments on campus who help us assist how we best manage those very limited resources. A lot of our buildings, when they were built, there weren't a lot of single rooms, or if they were single rooms, maybe
or
they
elevators.
were not. Right, that too. Thank you very much. If they were built, they weren't set up with accessible points. And so as we progress and we review our buildings' operating capacity, we also work very closely with these partners to make sure that we are identifying the best location for our students. We all wish that the students would tell us sooner rather than later what their needs are. What we find is that once the assignment letter goes out, we have a spike in ADA accommodations that happen. And so we have to work with our campus partner, and they're amazing to help us determine how we prioritize those spaces or what changes we should be making now during the summer, or as we learn that these students need these types of accommodations in order to have equal access to our learning spaces.
And I talk with my colleagues in disability access services on my campus weekly, if not multiple times throughout the week. And I feel very fortunate that I have such a strong relationship with them, and they're very good advocates for the housing system here. I've talked to 2 colleagues on other campuses where that relationship isn't as strong, and it's a struggle. So I'm grateful every day that I've got really strong partnerships there, because the number of students who are seeking accommodations, whether it's when they apply for housing, after they're assigned, after they're living here, is continuing to grow every year. And I'll just quickly throw this in here. This would be a whole other session, and it has been a whole other session, but ADA is also where we're talking about our lovely emotional support animals in residence and how that nuance plays into the living environments.
Absolutely.
So with that, next one here is athletics. Silvina and I both have I'm going to go with privilege of saying that we work at Pac-12 institutions where the NCAA regulations are involved. We've got a lot of student athletes who are living with us. I know as part of my annual renewal with my position, it says that I have to maintain the responsibilities within the NCAA. So I am making sure that I'm up to date in those policies and how it reflects specifically to the living environment, because my job is literally on the line if I don't pay attention to that. So that's particular nuance. Excuse me. I find that a lot of coaches are involved in the process for students. And so as we work to talk specifically to students about what their housing assignment is, I often find that coaches are an intermediary for their student athletes, and how that can be both a hindrance and a help to a student coming to campus. And again, there's that the uniqueness of that relationship on, do all the athletes live together for a particular sport? How do we manage that so they don't go over 49% of the floor? Things like that. So that's always one of our biggest partnerships.
And Kathryn, I think one of the things specifically for the first three groups that we've talked about is making sure that our campus partners in these areas are aware of the spaces that we do have and those that we don't have, nor can we create as part of our next assignment cycle. Because we want to make sure that whatever they're sharing with students and families is something that we can deliver on as it relates to the assignment process.
You kind of lead right into that whole VIP and legacy process there. Yeah, that's an area we'll just touch on briefly, I think, because it's people who are the squeaky wheels who can get things accomplished for themselves. Oftentimes when we're talking about legacies, those are people who have either family or close friends who have attended the institution before them. Oftentimes their last name might be on the name of one of our buildings. So there's the cases that high touch and handheld throughout the process.
That's right. And you never know where they're going to come from and when. And so recognizing that, asking the questions of your directors and others, just saying, hey, anybody out there that we need to be looking for, just in advance can set you up for success, but also recognizing that you're going to have someone who shows up as a VIP. For us, the legacies is another big thing, especially as over the years, we have renovated some of our buildings, but the family member who attended the school remembered the building being a certain way. So there are certain values attached to placement and the history behind. So working with some of that, as someone who also worked in alumni relations, I recognize that those are important relationships. And so we want to foster those and be mindful of our communication and how we continue to build on their experience of our universities, because we recognize that they are also current and future donors. And what we say or do tends to stay with them.
And they can be those high volume and high amount donors as well. And so that can matter when it comes to making sure that the experience is good for them.
That's right.
Silvina, I believe this next one, the group advocates and interests, was one of yours. So I'm going to let you take that.
Of course. So for us, when this comes up is when we have a particular organization on campus that is seeking to advocate on behalf of their students for specific housing assignments, or in our case for exemptions. And so, for example, when you have we have a live-on requirement here at the University of Oregon as well as Oregon State. And so for us, residing in a fraternity or sorority is not part of that exemption. And so in other words, we may have these organizations and their chapter advisors who are advocating for their particular groups in order to seek some type of exemptions. And you never know what's the flavor of the year as it relates to that. A lot of these group advocates are also our partners when it relates to getting initiatives off the ground. A lot of our institutions have had policies around and procedures of placing students in our gender equity gender neutral housing, whatever terminology is currently on your campus, but it's through these group advocates and interest groups that we have been able to get a lot of momentum behind that. So they can either be very supportive and generating some change, and kind of building a network so that it's not just housing wanting to move forward in these initiatives, but rather gardening some support, or they can also be the group that creates the voice, or as Kathryn referred to earlier, sort of the squeaky wheel, in this case, wheels around certain topics to make sure that we are listening and moving forward. So for us, we deal with this as it relates to assignment advocacy as well as exemption advocacy.
Got it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Next one here is so business and finance. So your business office for your university, depending on how you do the finances. So if you do your own receivables within your department or you bill out to the university. For us, we don't do our own receivables for students. We bill to their university accounts. But we have meetings on a frequent basis with our business office about what's the billing structure like for each term coming up, and it's impactful when the tuition gets assessed, when housing gets assessed, and then when, of course, financial aid and scholarship funds get applied to accounts. We also get questions from our finance office of, this charge looked weird. Is this what you wanted to do? Or this student is protesting these charges. What's your process for that appeal? So things like that. So we find that it's great to have a very strong partnership on that level.
Thank you. As it relates to facilities or physical plants, some of our institutions, you have your own facilities team, or you have to, sorry, Kathryn, or you have to work with other campus partners around that. Here at the University of Oregon, we are really fortunate, as well as Oregon State, to have their own facilities teams. But there's also a lot of collaboration and partnerships around that, because as we do our projections and we have to deal with overflow, this is the team that we have to go to help us create those spaces by either removing or adding facilities. And unfortunately, not many of us have our own warehouse on campus whereby we can remove and take easily without creating a bit of chaos. And so working with our facilities team to letting them know, this is what we're seeing the trend, this is where we may need to make some changes to our spaces. So having those relationships, because you will call on them last minute as the students are moving in saying, we need an extra bed, we need you to take the bed out. And so for us is, how do we manage that? So having those strong relationships, whether you have the good fortune of having your own, but also outside. I work with a lot of our campus partners around facilities needs and other needs when it comes to move in and move out, because it is not an ancillary event. And so we need to reach out both internally as well as externally.
Absolutely. And along those lines too, residential life staff, residential education, Silvina and I both come from bigger departments where residential life is a part of our same department. Some areas and some campuses, it's a bifurcated system, which I believe Andrew's team at Washington State, it's separated out in different areas. But either way, they're a partner, whether they're internal staff and colleagues or they're external staff to another department. But making sure that as they're building a new living learning community, that they're working with us on both space planning and even just helping identify what are the trends that we're seeing. As we talked about trend data, is someone coming in wanting to build an LLC about outdoor recreation, and is that really going to fill space? And are they wanting to put it in our brand new building that doesn't need help filling beds?
Absolutely. And to add to that, I think, our live-in team, our residence life team is absolutely critical as we progress throughout the year, as we're moving students in, because we're giving them a group of students based upon our projections and our assignments, and then we're asking them to just make wonderful things and create the least amount of movement that we can as part of that. And so for me, it's important to give them context about where we are, where we're seeing some of the changes and why some of those changes need to happen, rather than just expecting our staff to take on the student roster and the occupant and take off with it. So keeping them informed, especially when you're messing with their living environment by adding or taking spaces away, and then recognizing sort of whether this is a permanent or whether this is a temporary and how temporary that is. So continue that, those conversations are absolutely critical.
Absolutely.
The other one is dining. You know, we oftentimes think that in terms of occupancy, we just need to find them a place to live. But dining is a huge component of what we do in terms of working with students with food allergies and trying to find them spaces. Here at my institution, both room and board are a combined experience. And so for us, we want to make sure that our students understand the types of dining that is available, and also communicate to our dining team anything that we hear around room changes, and also kind of meal plan needs. And so for us, it's just a wonderful experience because we recognize that, you know, shelter and food are two of the biggest components for our students, whether it is recognized at the start or not, but are two of the biggest things that we try to make sure they're doing okay.
Maslow knew what he was talking about.
That's right.
Yeah, and so here on our campus, you know, we're University Housing and Dining Services. So dining is one of our biggest elements, and we require students to have a dining plan. And it's been fascinating over my tenure here just to see how our dining operation has evolved to the point where we actually have what we call a food forest, where we're growing vegetables literally outside of one of our residence halls and then serving them up in a dining center that's adjacent to it, which is pretty phenomenal. And we work with some of the educational components on our campus too. There's students who have a class out in our food forest who might live in that residence hall right there. So we're very much partners in that process, and it can become a very great marketing resource and tool for us. I talked to a student a couple of years ago who made their decision to attend our institution because they finally found food options that would work with their food allergies in our dining center.
Absolutely, it all works together.
Mm-hmm.
As it relates to student life and affairs, for many of us, this is sort of the larger umbrella that we all reside in. For the University of Oregon, we have a little bit of a twist. We are also part of enrollment services and student services. And so for us, having to operate within those two umbrellas and recognizing that there are a lot of partners out there advocating for the student experience and how can we engage them? How can we connect our students with those resources? This is also part of the umbrella that we get a lot of group advocates, VIPs, and legacies. So it's an exciting component there.
And then the last one on this list, and again, this is not by all means a comprehensive or complete list, but the reason it's bolded too is we spend a lot of our times working with this area. We've got our parents, we've got our families, we've got friends. A large part of my job is being that person that when a parent is particularly, we call them hot. So in terms of they are frustrated, they are unhappy, they need to talk or yell at someone, that usually comes to me after they've been through a few other people. But the people who are highly invested in that partnership and that process for their students. And one of the things that we've seen is that that group has continued to be involved at a higher level almost every year. And part of that is education's expensive. It costs a lot to get your higher education degree. And so there's that level of investment. They are investing in this process and they have expectations and demands on how that service looks. And as we try to balance the elements of customer service in higher education, you know, it's not necessarily that the customer is always right. And in fact, I believe that that's a false narrative. What they are is the customer is always justified. There is always something behind the story that you're hearing. So a parent might say, I need you to move my student's roommate out of their room because of XYZ situation. Well, I'm not going to do that, but I am going to listen to them and find out what options I've got available for their student and probably involve my partners in our residential education program to make sure that we're reaching out to their student. So I want them to feel validated. I want them to feel heard. And I want to be a partner in that process moving forward.
Absolutely. And if I could just add one more thing, is that
Please.
a lot of our parents, families, and friends are also reaching out to other departments on campus who are also then contacting us for similar information. So looking at those opportunities as ways to continue to educate, to continue to share our story so that the next time the campus partners get these calls or try to refer families to us, they have at least a little bit of context around some of those expectations and help us facilitate some of that. Because if our campus partners and advocates are saying, yeah, you should get that, and then they get to us and we're saying, I'm not sure how we can make that happen. Oftentimes that experience can be a little bit adversarial. So having those opportunities and taking every opportunity to go back to our campus partners so that in the future, when they're engaging with parents, families, and friends, and sometimes other relatives, that they have as much information as possible.
Absolutely. Okay, so this next slide here is kind of a visual representation of a lot of what we've been talking about, or as I dub it, Kathryn's poor attempt at trying to be any sort of designer. But one of the things that we talk about a lot on our campus is the competing factors in the occupancy process. And ultimately, your occupancy drives your budget. I mentioned earlier when Silvina was talking about this, this is especially felt when the occupancy is low and the budget is becoming at a critical point. But what are we talking about here? All these competing factors. So we've got our students, right? We've got the students who are going to be living with us. We've got our university culture and our stakeholders, the stakeholders we were just talking about. Silvina mentioned, people who lived in a building before it was renovated and having perceptions on that. Or if there was a living learning community in a building before, or students who have been here previously who know what the process is like or know what to expect, and they're telling that information to other students coming up. We've got our demand for space. We've constantly got new ideas for living learning communities coming up. We've got our athletic partners, we've got our accommodation needs that are out there, and there's only so much space, our inventory of space, right? I can't have 8 different living learning communities in a building that serves 300 people. One of my buildings, usually it holds about 350 people, and my demand for that space is about 1,200. That's a lot of conversations we get to have for people who are upset about not getting into that building, because that math just does not work out. So our inventory is only so big, and all of those areas there are constantly either working together on a good day or in competition with each other for our attention and our space.
Wonderful.
And I won't quit my day job and go into design work.
No, I think there's potential there. And if we can see this, I know that there are times when you wish that there were tools out there for you to make things happen. This is something that I came across, and it was one of those moments where I felt life was good. Imagine if we could have these types of materials available to us where we could build and create spaces as needed, right? So if there's a roommate conflict, let's just split up the room and use these blocks to create 2 single spaces. Again, this just brought a lot of positive thoughts. And I really enjoyed sort of the visual. The other thing too is if you have a magic 8-ball that works well, you might want to have it on hand. If you are in the world of occupancy, oftentimes you're asked to predict, to anticipate. So the one thing I'd like to note is there minus the alcohol drink at the end.
Yeah.
So the Lego part is just amazing. And hopefully it would be something that you can reference and laugh in those moments of trying to make things happen.
When Silvina and I did the session during NWACUHO, we actually brought little magic 8-balls to give out to the group who attended. And I mentioned this earlier, we're kind of the Al Rokers of housing. That's really in some ways what we are. So hopefully we're a little more informed than some of the weather forecasts that are out there sometimes. But sometimes you can have as much luck asking your magic 8-ball what your fall occupancy is going to be than you are looking at the actual enrollment data. So it really can shift as easily as the wind.
Wonderful. And just to end, before we open it up for questions, if there are any, the purpose of this particular session was just to connect the terminology, identify some of our campus partners, and really stress the fact that we don't work in a bubble. What we do is a community partnership, and oftentimes we're working on the today. For some of us, we're moving students out today, and at the same time, we're preparing for what the move-in process, what the new students will look like. So it's not just a one and done. It just keeps going in circles. And hopefully you took away some concepts and some opportunities to go out there and build some connections with other campus partners.
And sometimes you're moving 60 people in the middle of the night because you're dealing with a student in crisis like I did last week.
That's right. And last night I had someone who decided to set off a fire extinguisher, which means that we have to relocate some students if they have allergies related to that.
That's why we can't have nice things.
That's right.
So we've reached the end of our content. We wanted to open it up to any questions that you all had. We can also use this therapy time to talk through any stories that we've all experienced. Again, I alluded to the situation that we had on campus last week. Occupancy management often on the best of days gives you a lot of time to plan out and make thoughtful decisions. And on some of the other days, it means you're trying to get people reallocated as quickly as possible so that they can have a place to sleep that night. Andrew, do we have any questions coming in or any comments?
I'm monitoring. It doesn't look right now, but we'll give it another minute or so just because there's a little lag time there. And we'll just make sure we see if there's any questions here.
Well, as we wait for those to come through, I want to wish all of our semester friends a happy and productive closing process. I know that's what Andrew's working on after we're done here. I know many of our Canadian colleagues have already finished up their year, and especially down here in quarters where we go till mid-June, I'm very jealous and hope that you had a great year and have a wonderful summer.
All right. Shelley Clark says she does not have any questions, but thanks for a wonderful and wonderful information.
Well, thank you, Madam President.
Oh, it even says Shelley Clark, President. That's cool. I have a thank you from Western Washington University as well, from I believe Dong Vo.
Oh, Dong's an old colleague of mine. Hi, Dong.
Give it just a few more seconds here, see if we have anything else pop up.
And if you have questions or want to talk offline after the session, we're both fairly active on social media. I think our Twitter handles have been out there a few times. Silvina's on the board. I was a while ago, but people can find us if you've got questions or want to talk through anything that you've heard today or want any clarity on anything. We'd be happy to provide that.
All right, and I think with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up for the day. Thank you again for that great and informative presentation. I've already posted the link for the assessment, and we'll meet back here on June 1st, I believe, for June's first Friday webinar. Thanks for attending, everyone.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you. Goodbye.